but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. This verse commands an attitude that goes against human instinct. It is natural to dread suffering, avoid hardship, and lament persecution. But Peter calls Christians to rejoice in suffering, not merely endure it. This rejoicing is rooted in a profound theological truth. To suffer for Christ is to partake in his sufferings. It is a badge of honor that marks true discipleship. Jesus himself declared in Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 through 12, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven." The phrase, "partake of Christ's sufferings," carries deep significance. Christ, though sinless, suffered rejection, scorn, and ultimately the cross for the sake of the gospel and his people. When believers endure similar trials for the sake of their faith, they identify with their Savior. This shared experience binds them to Christ in a unique and profound way. Philippians chapter 3, verse 10 expresses this desire, "that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death." This rejoicing is not just for the present, but anticipates the future revelation of Christ's glory. When he returns, the faithful who have suffered for his name will experience unparalleled joy. Romans chapter 8, verse 18 affirms, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." The temporary nature of earthly trials stands in stark contrast to the eternal joy and reward awaiting those who endure. Furthermore, the phrase, "when his glory is revealed," points to a specific moment in redemptive history, the second coming of Christ. Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 16 vividly portrays his triumphant return as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, a moment when all will see his majesty and power. For the faithful, this is a day of vindication and joy. For the unfaithful, it is a day of terror and judgment. The believer's endurance in suffering now directly impacts their joy and reward on that glorious day. This verse demands that Christians confront their perspective on suffering. Are you prepared to face persecution, rejection, and hardship for the name of Christ? The call to rejoice in suffering is not a suggestion, it is a command rooted in the gospel. If you avoid trials or complain about them, you are failing to honor the Savior who endured far greater suffering for you. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 2 through 3 reminds us of Jesus' example. "Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls." Rejoicing in suffering requires an eternal perspective. If your focus is on earthly comfort, you will miss the refining work God is doing through trials. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 exhorts, "Count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." Trials are not a sign of God's abandonment, but of his sanctifying presence in your life. Examine the reason for your suffering. Are you suffering for Christ, or are your hardships the result of sin or poor decisions? First, Peter chapter 4, verse 15 warns against suffering for wrongdoing, saying, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters." True suffering for Christ arises from living a life of obedience, holiness, and bold proclamation of the gospel. This verse also calls for endurance. Trials are not momentary inconveniences, but divine appointments to refine your character and deepen your faith. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17 reminds us, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." Do not grow weary in the face of trials, but stand firm, knowing that your suffering is not in vain. Finally, let this verse drive you to greater devotion and courage. The glory of Christ's return will overshadow every earthly pain and loss. Live with your eyes fixed on that day, rejoicing in the privilege of suffering for the one who suffered for you. Let your joy in trials testify to the world that your hope is not in this life, but in the eternal promises of God. Rejoice, endure, and glorify Christ, for the joy that awaits you is beyond comprehension.